Hello champions, GM Avatik is here with you, and today I will show you a game where white won it without any tactics, without any calculations. Just a simple strategy, a few correct exchanges, changing opponents' good pieces, and that's it. Unfortunately, many amateurs think that the tactic is everything in chess, spending many hours solving just puzzles, ignoring learning strategy in chess, and then they find out themselves in the same place after a few years. I hope after this game you will get the idea how important it is to learn strategy in chess, and you will stay on the right path of improving your chess skills. Let's go with white plays Rosentalis Eduardes against Apple Ralph. e4, knight f6, Alochin defense. e5, knight d5, and here in the game was played g3. This is not the main line, but very interesting move. White want to play g3, bishop g2, have a fine get of bishop, and bishop g2 will be developed with tempo, attacking the d5 and knight. d6 was played, e d6, we will not go inside of the opening. e d6, bishop g2, knight f6, knight goes back, d4, d5. Looks like a symmetrical pawn structure, it should be equal, but it's not so clear. Knight f3, bishop e7, short castle, and knight e5. White's plan is next move to play f4, having very strong knight on e5, or first knight c3 and then f4. Having strong knight on e5, weakening the e4 square. But the thing here is that bishop g2 and knight c3, they together cover the problem of e4 weak square. Knight bd7 was played, knight c3, using the fact that after knight e5, the e5, the pawn attacks the knight on f6, and when the knight moves, black will lose the d5 pawn. After knight c3 was played c6 and f4, a strong move. Having strong knight on e5, and here black decided to exchange this knight. Knight e5, fe5, and go knight e8 back. White achieved something big. Their pawn from f2 came to e5, playing f4 and then fe5, and with that rook on f1 is opened. Without moving anywhere the rook, white just castled, and now rook on f1 is doing a great job, putting some pressure on f7 pawn, and he is developed very good on a half open line. And here in the game was played queen h5, very good move. In such positions, queen on h5 placed very well. The thing is, black cannot attack this queen on h5 easily with any of their pieces. And if black goes here, let's say g6, white will just go queen e2 back. And with g6, black weakens their king and the dark squares next to it. And here, bishop on c1 will be developed on h6, a very good square for him, also attacking the f8 rook with tempo. After queen h5, black decided to play here f5. A strategically dubious move, and their idea is after f5 at some point to play knight c7 and knight e6, have a good knight on e6, which will block the post pawn on e5, and then have here a pawn majority advantage in the king side. It will be 3 against 2. At the same time, if white takes ef6, then just knight f6 and all the problem is solved for black, because what they achieved, they changed their f7 pawn with e5, our strong pawn, and also knight came to f6 with tempo. So after f5, ef6 is not a good move. But how to continue? And this is the first position which I offer you to pause the video and think a bit for white, what plan to choose. Okay, usually in such cases where you don't know exactly what to do next, should you play bishop d2, rook a1, or should you play rook f2, rook af1, you should find a plan for yourself. Well, you can develop that pieces, but what's next? Are you going to play at some point h3, g4, or are you going to play with b3, c4? And very often it's very useful questions that we can ask ourselves is what is opponent's plan? And when we find out what is opponent's plan, very easy will be for us to find our move. In this case, we already figured out that black want to play knight c7, knight e6, and have a good knight on e6. This is one of the chess rules. When our opponent has post pawn, put there your knight, because knight is a very good blocker of post pawns. And in this case, in the game was played knight e2, a very good and very deep strategical move. The thing is that after black plays knight c7, knight e6, white wants to play knight f4 and change that blocker on e6. Knight c7 was played, c3, knight e6, white was played c3, so when white goes here knight f4, d4 pawn is protected with a pawn on c3. And here it would be already possible to go on knight f4, but in the game was played h4, strong move. What's the idea? After knight f4, black can go g5. And after knight e6, bishop e6, yes, black, it seems they weakened their king, but it's more important than they have 3 pawns against 2 and clear pawn majority advantage in the king side. Also, bishop c1 becomes passive. So with that reason was played h4 first, stopping a g5 move, and next preparing knight f4. h4 has one more purpose, which you will see soon. Rook f7, and how to continue? Yeah, knight f4. Knight f4 changing this good blocker on e6. Knight f4 was played, bishop f4, bishop e6. And now it's the second position where I offer you to pause the video and think how to continue for white. Okay, we should figure it out at first what are our best pieces and what are our opponent's best pieces, and maybe black has a bad piece. And it's now becomes very clear that bishop on e6 is a bad piece. It's blocked with his d5 and f5 pawn. Well, it's blocked our e5 pawn, but bishops are bad blockers. If here was knight on e6, it would be totally different story. And in such cases, it becomes very useful for us to change another bishop, in this case the dark squares. This is overall rule. Whenever opponent pawns are on the light squares, we should change the opponent's dark square. And the same is true if the pawns are on dark squares, bishop on dark squares become bad. And in this case, as we figured out already, this bishop on e6 is bad, and for white this is a bad bishop, because white pawns are on the dark squares. And here becomes very clear that it will be white's favor to play bishop g5 and change these bishops. Bishop on e7 is a good one, he controls the dark squares, and here our bishop on f4 is a bad one, because our pawns are on the dark squares too. So now becomes clear that changing this bishop it's become white's favor. We can play here bishop g5 and change them. In the game was played rook f2, very deep move. Instead of bishop g5, white delays bishop g5 move, because anyway, if black goes here h6, not allowing bishop g5, then after h6, f5 pawn gonna be very weak. Let's say black here goes h6, not allowing bishop g5 move. Here white goes rook af1. And then after bishop e3 and moving back the bishop on e3, white 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces will attack the f5 pawn, and black will have problems of defending it. The thing is that after h6 move, now g6 becomes impossible. While when the pawn is on h7, with g6 they can protect their all pawns in the king side. And with rook f2, white also prepares bishop f1, bishop d3, rook af1 maneuver. Bishop on d3 will be better than on h3. At the same time with rook f2, at some point b2 pawn rook will protect. So rook f2 also take care in the plan of defending the queen side. Queen a5 was played, a3, c5, bishop e3, not allowing black to play cd4. cd4, open the c line and play rook c8. Let's say after bishop f1, black would play cd4, cd4 and rook c8, gaining some counterplay with this c line. So was played bishop e3 first, with the idea after cd4 to take bishop d4. After bishop e3, black decided to go c4, closing the old queen side, and thinking that their position is enough solid and white cannot break through. But it was continued to rook af1, rook f8, and here how to continue? I offer you to pause the video and think a few seconds. I'm sure you guessed the idea. Yeah, especially now when another pawn is on light square, so there are 3 pawns in the center. Now bishop on e6 becomes bad, and bishop on e7 is a good one. Also for white, this bishop on g5 is a bad bishop, because there are all pawns in the center are on the dark square, so bishop g5 changing the bishops. Queen d8 was played, bishop e7, queen e7. And now another critical position where white should figure it out what is their plan. Well, black has a bad bishop on e6, but how to break through, how to win the game. And here it is critical to understand, should white goes to the king side or should they go to the queen side? Well, g4 we don't go, because opponent has a bad bishop on e6, but the only things he does is he protects his pawn on d5, protects f5 pawn, and also not allow our g4 move. Also, if somehow we prepare the g4 move, opponent bishop on e6 will become a good one. So white's correct plan is to go to the queen side at some point, preparing rook b1, b3, and bishop on e6 will continue to be a bad bishop. If white achieves this rook b1, b3 and changes b2 pawn with c4, well, white will have a c3 weak pawn, but opponent will have problems with d5 pawn, because at some point rook b5 move gonna be possible attacking the d5 pawn. Also b7 pawn. We will see this. So a4 was played first. Why a4? Because first of all, if we go at some point b3, a3 is hanging. So a4, black played queen at d7, attacking the a4 pawn, and queen d1, another deep move. White's queen did his job in the king side, and now he moves to the queen side. White preparing queen a1, queen a3, where queen from a3 will support his rooks, where after rook b1, b3 and rook b2, white will put pressure on the queen side. Rook c8 was played and a5, another very deep move. Before playing queen a1, white plays a5. Why? Because after queen a1, queen a3 and rook b1, b3, when this b and c4 pawn will be changed, white will have two good rooks on b2 and b1, and both will put pressure on b7. And when white has a5 pawn, black cannot go b6. Let's say white did the same without a5 move and started with queen a1, let's say b6, then after rook b1, b3, what then? The pawns are a7, b6 and white cannot attack there. So a5, very deep one. Rook cf8 was played, queen a1. Preparing queen a3, rook b1, b3, after which rook b2 and black will have problems with their b7 pawn and also with d5 1. Queen e7 was played, not allowing queen a3. And here again I offer you to pause the video and think how to continue forward. Well, here it would be possible to go rook b1, b3, but in the game was played queen a3, another very deep move. It looked like after queen a3, ba3, white will have here weak pawns on a3 and c3, but it's not. Black cannot attack these pawns, while it's open the b line. So after rook b1, rook b2, b7 will have problems, and also after rook b5, d5 pawn will have problem. And this is a much better pawn structure than if white played with b3. Because if white go, let's say, rook b1, rook c8, b3, cb3, rook b3, yeah? Now c3 pawn is weak and it's easier for black to attack this pawn. While after queen a3, ba3, there is a pawn on c4, so for black gonna be very tough to attack this c3 pawn. Rook c8, rook c7 doesn't give anything for black. And after queen a3, black should have kept that queen, but they did another mistake and changed the queens. Queen a3, ba3 was played, but anyway, by the way, if queen c7, white would go rook b1, b3, rook b2 as we talked already about, and then b7 and d5. Black will have two weak pawns, while white has just one weak pawn on c3, and also one of black problems is their bad bishop on e6, which is defender. While white bishop is attacker, he attacks the d5 pawn. At some point he can go to attack f5 pawn. He can also go to f1 and do whatever he wants. While black has a bishop, which is not a bishop, it's in this case it's just a big pawn. So queen a3, ba3. White is planning to go rook b1 and rook b2. Black played rook d8, rook b2, rook c7, rook b5, rook d7, and king f2. Now king comes to king f2, king e3, and then it will decide. But at some point he may need to go king f4. Black cannot do anything, as they should just wait. So they put their rooks on c7 and d7. So both rooks protect the b7 pawn, and also rook d7 and bishop e6 protects the d5 pawn. g6 was played. Black just wait for white. King e3, king g7, rook fb1, king f7. And now I offer you again to pause the video and think how to continue for white. Well, black has here two weak pawns, b7 and d5, but how to convert this advantage into win. Okay, it was played rook c5, strong move. Rook c5 with the idea not just exchange the rooks, but prepare rook b5. And now two rooks and bishop on g2 will attack the d5 pawn. And if black exchanges this rook after rook c5, dc5, king will come to d4. After rook c5 was played king e7, rook bb5. Now bishop d5 is coming, also rook c7, then bishop d5, and black is forced to change the rooks. And after rook c5, not rook c5, but dc5, preparing king d4 move. King d8 was played. Now king d4 would be fine, but in the game was played another cool move a6, sacrificing a pawn, because after a6, ba6, well, black will have two pawns here, but they don't feel this extra pawn, while with this taking b7 pawn from there, now c5 pawn becomes a post pawn. And here it will be rook b8 check, king c7, rook e8, attacking the bishop on e6. After bishop f7, white can go rook h8, attacking the h7 pawn. And after bishop e6, king d4, with next move rook f8, rook f6, attacking the e6 pawn, the game will be over. So a6, a very cool move by white, creating c5 post pawn. King c8 was played. And here another nice move, rook b6. Using the tactics that after a b6, a7, and black cannot stop a8 queen, and after rook b6 attacking the bishop on e6, rook goes to d6 or rook f6. After bishop on e6 will be moved here. Bishop g8 was played, rook f6, and now it's coming rook d8 check, rook d8 was played, king d4. White could also play ab7 first, ab7, king b7 and king d4, but they played king d4 right away, because anyway, after ba6, black cannot fill this extra pawn, and here again, rook a6 would be possible, but in the game was just rook d6, ignoring this pawn, because black cannot use it anyway. Next move is coming bishop d5, after which c4 pawn will hang, and then with c5 and d5, these two post pawns, black cannot save the game. Black felt it and just resigned. Look what a cool game it was played by Rosentalis. Actually, the only tactic that was in the game, it was this rook b6 move. Before it was just a few correct exchanges. Everything started with knight e2 move in this position. Knight e2, so after knight c7 and knight e6, white plays knight f4, changing the knights. Then it was exchange of the dark square bishop with bishop g5. After it was a very cool plan when white decided to switch to the queen side with a4, queen d1, queen a1, queen a3, and when opponent queen was on e7, looks like a queen a3. It is impossible, but it was possible. So queen a3, and after queen a3, ba3, rook b1, rook b2. And then when the king was on a3 and it was important moment how to win this game, how to find a plan to win the game, it was played rook c5, another strong move. Rook c5 with idea rook b5. Also, if black at some point play a6, not allowing rook b5, then instead of rook b5, rook b6, it would be a disaster for black. Rook b6 and then rook d6. So white, black allowed rook b5 move, but then after rook c5, dc5, strong move. Next is coming king d4, and after king d8, a6, creating c5 post pawn. Soon white won the game. Look at the last position. White has light square bishop, and their all pawns are on dark squares. And look now at opponent's bishop. They have bishop on g8, and they almost all pawns are on the light squares too. Only a7 pawn is on dark squares. This you will see a lot if you explore a Grandmaster or Masters games. They try to put their pawns on opposite color of the bishop. And in this game, Rosentalis accomplished it, showing a masterpiece. So, dear friends, don't think that tactics is everything in chess. Strategy and tactics, they are good friends, and in your game should be both tactics and strategy, but tactics should be based on strategy. Grandmasters was with you. See you during the next games.